So we've talked about measuring benefits of environmental regulations. Let's talk a little bit more about how we measure costs. So to measure cost for environmental regulations, we can usually think about some different levels. So at the first level, we can think about an individual firm. If we have a factory, a paper mill, and it currently emits a water waste into a river, a lot of the byproducts of the pulping procedure create all of this refuse. They put it in some settling ponds, but what's left from that goes into the river. But that contains pollutants, biological oxygen demand, and some other things. So how do we measure the cost to this firm of a regulation that says you can't emit any sort of biological oxygen demand pollutants into this river because we're designating it a national scenic river, so we want it to be crystal clear water? Well, what we would do in that case, to look at the factory level, we would usually use essentially engineering data. We would look at what other factories have done in the past. We would have some engineers that come in and say, well, to get rid of all the BOD in the water, we would have to put on this and add this secondary sort of treatment, and then we would have to run it through the public wastewater facility. Doing all of those things, we can estimate how much they would cost for this firm. So that's how we come up with the cost for a firm. It's usually the simplest level of estimating cost, is thinking about what a firm would do. Because we can usually essentially think about what the engineers tell us we would have to do to make that level of pollution control happen. The next level up is to look at, say, an industry. If instead of thinking about a paper mill, we're thinking about the paper industry, there are a bunch of mills. So now we'll probably start with actually the first level, the firm level, right? But then we would multiply that out essentially by all the different firms that we have in this industry. We would try to use a firm that was representative. Usually it would be more than one. We would take a sample of firms, try to figure out what it would cost for the average one in that sample, and then multiply it out to get the idea for the whole industry. Things get a little more complicated at the industry level though, because we're going to have market effects now. If we regulate one factory, it probably won't do too much to the paper market in general. Prices for paper won't change a whole lot. Input prices probably won't change a whole lot. But if we're talking about a major regulation of a whole industry, we're going to be shifting that supply curve up, which means we're going to be changing the equilibrium price. It's now going to be higher, and the quantity demanded is going to be lower. So we're going to have these changes, and consumers are going to bear some of that additional price. Producers are going to lose out on some profit because of that higher price and lower quantity. So we have to start thinking about these market effects when we're thinking at the industry level now. Now it gets even more complicated if we go up another level and look at, say, the national level. Now, at the national level, we're often talking about environmental regulations in general, or environmental regulations that are have a very wide coverage as far as parts of the economy. So something like regulating carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions, that's the sort of thing that is far-reaching enough that it would affect a lot of parts of everyday life for us consumers and also for producers, because transportation would become more expensive, plastics would become more expensive, energy would become more expensive. Those are things that all of us use, right? So we could think about how would a carbon tax or a carbon cap and trade program affect the national economy. Now, there are two ways to do that. One is to use a bottom-up approach. So we actually work with what we've done before. We had the firm level and we went to the industry level. Well, we've done that for a lot of industries. If we've done it for all of the big industries, then we can actually kind of add those all together and we get the national estimate. The other way to go is a top-down approach, and that's essentially using mathematical models, economic models that look at things like input and capital and productivity and we look at how environmental regulations across time and across places have tended to affect things like how much people invest in new capital, how much productivity growth we see. And we can use estimates based on that to figure out how regulation of something like carbon dioxide would affect our growth rate and capital formation going forward. So that would be a top-down approach. All right, so those are kind of the levels that we think about when we're thinking about estimating the costs of regulations. You could even go up another level and look at the international level with something like climate change. As you can imagine, that gets even more complicated. Whether using the bottom-up approach or the top-down approach. We usually see the top-down approach if we're looking at cross-country sort of issues. All right.